Mission of Switzerland. We are very pleased to see all of you inscribed and participating in the second module of the policy review of the operational activities for development. The second module has been delivered in due time. We had a certain delay in module 1, it was very also successful. This series, 2020, goes under the title, Realizing the Future We Want. We're trying to give you the vision of a tailored and targeted development system in support of countries' efforts to advance the Agenda 2030. As I said at the beginning, this is an interactive discussion split as your country names, organization you represent to the chat, to the screen, like that we can identify you and you communicate relevant information to you. The other thing is that please participate, make comments, put questions all the time, those are welcome. And so this will create a more pleasant time among you. We will start this with an overall direction of purposes and expectation of the UN reform. We have Mr. James Wendell with us, which is the special advisor of the Secretary General on the reform process of the United Nations. I will say a few words of him, the other high-level panelists with us. But I wanted to make a general comment, and it's related to the situation and why we are in this fashion today. And everybody knows, everybody has been touched, or in a personal basis or in a social way by COVID-19. And the socioeconomic impact of this pandemic is not nothing that we can take it without serious concern. The policy review of the operational activity for development is the best tool that the United Nations has to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Millions has been affected and millions more will be affected. People with the job, they will be kind of shrinking in economics in the north part of the equator, and by the south, I don't want it even to think the impact of the socioeconomic of COVID-19. So we try to provide you with the best knowledge that we had, sharing with you the best information that we have in order to enable you when you go through the discussions of the resolution of the QCPR 2020, well prepared. Taking this seriously, because much of the decisions that you make through these resolutions will have an impact on somebody's life around the planet. So if we wanted to really combat poverty, if we wanted to have social inclusion, if we wanted really to leave a better world to coming generations, I am concerned about my son, for example, he's only 20. So we have to work hard now because we are in kind of a transition mode before the pandemic, and what we left behind for the rest of it. But we have a complex, a complete program with you. Mr. Jen Wendell is going to be a panelist and also a moderator. As I said to you, he is advisor of the Secretary General for the reform process. I can go a lot about what has been done and his work, but I'm going to make a very simple line for him. He has been since 1988 in the United Nations working in different capacities, and he has started in the office of junior professional officer in Western Samoa in 1998. So Jens, thank you very much for sharing your time with us. He is across the pond also, he is in Denmark, and he will deliver to you a presentation, and then he will moderate the panel. We have Mr. Robert Piper, then we have Mr. Ramiz Lapkarob, I'm sorry, apologize for that. Then we have Kasper from Denmark, and then we have Margot from Belize, who will be discussing so the several topics that we have. Closing remarks, more information on Module 3 will be shared by our dear friend Marcus Risley from the Permanent Mission of Switzerland. So this is interinstitutional training session. Take advantage of it. I am 100% sure Jens will say a few words about the distinguished panelists. For the interest of time, I will stop in here. I welcome very proudly, and I'm very happy to be able to help our colleagues and UNDS. Sina, thank you very much for all the support and the substantive work that you has been done. Marcus, thank you also for your commitment to this process. Jens, I'm going to yield to you now, and I am in your hands, and I'm going to learn too.
Thank you very much, Marcus. I think as this is a training session, let's move on quickly. What you should expect is that we kind of take you through initially a bird's eye view on how the UN development system is reforming, and also how it's responding to the guidance of the member states. And there will be, technically, you should expect 4 kind of segments in the presentation. And then after each segment, I'll moderate a brief discussion. First, there will be a kind of a presentation of the UN reform, of course, centered on the development reform, but nevertheless, the UN reform. And that will be done by me in my capacity as special advisor to the SG on reform. And then it will be followed by Robert Piper as the head of the Development Coordination Office. And he will touch upon the concrete but key elements of the UN reform process, where it's at. And he will also share some perspectives on the QCPR. Then we are happy to have 2 delegates, one each from North and one from South. It is Kasper Stenger from Denmark, country Philomen, and then Margaret St. John Sebastian from Belize. And here it's very important, these colleagues will be here as colleagues, that they will speak to their experience of the QCPR. And then finally, we have Ramiz Alakbarov from UNFPA, who is the acting deputy director of, deputy executive director of UNFPA. And Ramiz will talk about the impact of the repositioning on the ground from their perspective, so we really come down. And then there will be a general discussions where I hope we can bring all of you in interactively with the panel members, and I will be very happy to facilitate that. As you know from your many times on these calls, please use the chat function to ask for the floor or even put questions there. And I will have some colleagues from UNITAR who will support me in making that happen in a smooth way. So now what I will do is, which is very easy for me, I'll yield the floor to myself, and then I will try to give you a brief overview over the UN reform. So if I can just get the slides on the screen, I can see they're there. The UN reform, I put it in singular. And the reason is, if I can have the next slide. There are 3 elements in the reform. There's the development pillar, as you were, which is aimed at improving the UN's approach to the 2030 agenda overall. And then there are more specific things around improved governance, improved coordination, clear delineation of responsibilities with country teams, and then also consolidated support structures. Robert, but also Ramiz will be talking more to that. But I want to mention that the 2 other pillars, one is the peace and security architecture. And here, the core of the reform was to address fragmentation. And that matters also for the development reform, because a more unified, less fragmented, and more coherent peace and security architecture obviously is more effective in interacting with the development side. And later in the discussion, in particular, Robert holds also personal experience in this space and can help show the links between the 2. And then underpinning this, we came from a world where management reform was very much focused on the secretariat. And that is still relevant, so this is where we started. However, the development pillar also has significant management elements, and I'll return to that later. So I use the term UN reform because at the end of the day, there are 3 pillars, but there's only one UN, and therefore there's only one reform. And they are so interlinked. So success in one determines the success on the others, as it were. So please move on. Now, from kind of reform perspective, there have been 3 big milestones. And the first milestone was 1st January 2019, and that was the big reorganization milestone. We stood up a number of new departments, both in management and on the peace and security side. But most importantly, the resident coordinator system and the whole new development coordination office was moved over to the UN Secretariat. And the fact that we did not die in that process should not underestimate the effort it took actually to make that happen. It did happen, and it happened for all 3 pillars on 1st January. That was not the day we finished, that was the day we started, and I even think today that we're still, in a sense, adapting and trying to improve on the implementation of that milestone. The second big milestone was in June, July. It was kind of marked around an ECOSOC resolution, but this is where the development system policy, the guidance, the funding compact, a number of these elements, Robert will explain, this is where they came to be and they were introduced for the first time. That milestone had elements that stretched out all the way to today, but we were able to start implementing some elements of it, in particular in the regional review where we had a phase 1. But nevertheless, that was when on that time it became clear what this development reform really was all about. And then the third milestone is the milestone we are still working on, and we call it operational integration. You could also call it management, but this is where we are now integrating. So we are talking much more about a UN management platform than a secretariat, UNDP, UNICEF, etc. And this is because that a lot of collaboration needs to happen in that space. Next slide, please. Then I'd like to talk about the benefits. Please click again. Yeah, that a lot of the efficiency gains that there were member states were looking for, also from a QCPR perspective, they actually sit in the common business operations and the management pillar. And some of those are still under delivery. They are not delayed. Some of them are delayed, but some of them are not, because difficult issues like common premises, etc., we have set targets for 2022, knowing that they would be difficult. However, let me just hit some of them. There we have common premises. We have the concept of the mutual recognition, which first time was introduced by the ECOSOC in 2016. But we also start having much more technical discipline, you can say, things inside management like costing and pricing principles and common back offices. We can revert to this if there's an interest. Next slide, please. The other thing is that the reform, from the Secretary's point of view, from the get-go, had a common understanding of what does benefit mean. A reform that does not produce benefit means nothing. It's just a flurry of activities and uncertainty. And therefore, what we needed to do was to refine or define what benefit means, and that these are things like coherence, transparency, effectiveness, efficiency, accountability. These were the things that the Secretary General were committing to. They constitute the basis for discussing benefits. And that benefit that I have put here is, you will be giving the slides, and there's a hyperlink. It's in the public domain, and you can see how we're tracking the benefits now and how that changes over time. It is a very important part of the reform to demonstrate transparency instead of talking about it. Next slide. There are a number of risks we have seen, and I think these are particularly relevant for when you're going to discuss the QCPR. And let me hit a number of them. One of the risks to really make the reform effective is that we have very limited capital resources in the UN system. In some of the, in the Secretariat itself, there's no notion of a capital budget. So this means it's very hard to have investments necessary to do big IT systems adjustments, to invest in common premises. And as you can imagine, like in your private life, if you have to buy a house, if you can invest, you can make it very good. But if you don't have the investment money, it's difficult. Then that's also, it's very difficult for the UN system to articulate its organizational capacity. It talks a lot about mandates, it talks a lot about what it plans to do, but it actually is not very good on linking that with actual description of capacity. Then, as a system, we also have difficulties in continuous improvement and coordination and alignment. So in other words, we take a lot of decisions, but we have great difficulties in tracking them across the system. Then we have limited capacity to identify and capture benefits. In plain language, we can talk about results, but we're not very good in talking about the results of the results. And then there's a big category called cultural change, but a lot of this has to do, we are addicted to hierarchy, and also that it's difficult for us sometimes to create mobility for staff and other things. Culture, a lot of the culture is adverse to change. And then finally, we also need to ensure, you can say, timely management, member state support for the necessary changes. And this is, in a sense, the essence of some of your work, but it is a risk and it's a difficulty that we have. Finally, last slide. I just need next slide, please. Yeah. I'd like to share with you just a few reflections and then close out. What would make UN reform continue to deepen and deliver benefits? And on the substance side, I see three things one could consider. We could deepen the use of the Sustainable Development Goals, the targets and the indicators as the common substantive language across the traditional peace, development, and humanitarian pillars. Why I say traditional is that these pillars are kind of conceptual, that shows up bureaucratically, but in reality, they're very hard to distinguish if you sit in a country context. So the SDGs, if we deepen the use of that, we create common knowledge and understanding of the situation. And this is a language that is known widely outside the UN. We also increase the frequency and ambition for collaboration across UN governance bodies, as well as the UN internally has been struggling with fragmentation. So the same can be said, I think, with some reasonable level of confidence about the governance side. Finally, and I think this is important, decode the UN language and increase quality through a less is more approach. Just try to say to yourself the word quadrennial comprehensive review. Already that is such a language that creates distance. So is that necessary? And there's a lot of other of our languages coded to such a level, it is incomprehensible to people away from us. On the effectiveness, some thoughts there. What is very important is that we need increasingly to focus on proposals that will reduce UN transaction costs for management. In other words, a more process economic conscientiousness, a better understanding if we ask the system to do this, how much will it cost? Secondly, needless to say, you can see where we sit today. We just need to build on what we have achieved during COVID and just digitize conference services, management, analytics, etc. This is a very important thing for a global organization, and it's very important for our ability to be inclusive. And then finally, we just need to insist on common costing. In other words, yes, we operate differently as UN organizations, but making a payment, making a conference, making a report, a lot of these cost factors are the same. And today we don't have it, and we ought to have it. The final slide is just a slide saying you can go to reform.un.org and track information more there if you want to. So now I'd like to hand the floor back to myself, which also means that you can remove the screen, Delilah. And then I would like.
Jens, could you repeat, please? Your mic was cut. Could you repeat the last part, please?
Yes, I would like to ask the participants if there are any questions or comments to my presentation here. I can see in the chat that Tina is asking whether the slides will be shared with the participants later, and I think the answer to that question is yes. Please confirm.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And then, are there any other comments at this point? Good. Then what I just want to say is that if you look at the big picture, the reforms are integrated, and they really, and I like to repeat that, they depend on each other. So therefore, I know that you will be focusing later on the development side of the reform, but it's very important when we try now to lift the way we manage the United Nations, that we are aware that the other reform elements are also worth tracking, as it were. I do not think we should try to, we should save time for where the interest is. So therefore, Robert, with no further ado, can I transfer the floor to you, as it were, and then ask you to proceed with your presentation.
Absolutely, Jens. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone, or good afternoon if you're participating virtually from elsewhere out of North America. Thank you very much, UNITAR. I'm very pleased to have an opportunity to participate in this training. I'm Robert Piper. I'm the head of the Development Coordination Office, and I've been, as Jens mentioned, quite involved in the reform of the UN development system in particular. And my presentation is really mainly walking through that reform, and then, of course, arriving at the QCPR ahead of us. But recognizing that all of these reforms are actually embedded in the last QCPR, the 2016 QCPR. We have just spent the last 4 years executing the last QCPR in what I think everyone agrees is the most dramatic and historic reform efforts for development, at least in the UN, for at least the last 50 years. So it's been all about the QCPR. And I think if there's nothing else, a message about the importance of the QCPR process and its consequences, as you have seen. There was an enormous imperative to relook at the way the UN development system organizes itself on the ground. And I'd just like to restate the problem that needed to be fixed. For the last 50 years or so, until, maybe a decade ago, when we sat with governments as development professionals and we asked them to list off their priorities, these priorities tended to be articulated in terms of sectors: agriculture, health, education. And those sectors fit very nicely with the mandates of the UN system, because our UN development system is pretty much organized around sectors like education and health and agriculture. And the Millennium Development Goals kind of fit that paradigm very nicely as well, because they were all pretty much articulated around sectors. So you could come back from a conversation with the Prime Minister about her or his priorities, usually his, sit with the UN country team at the field level and talk through who's going to run with which question, which priority, and it usually fit pretty neatly into the mandate of one or more of your UN country team members. Health problem, WHO, agriculture problem, FAO, and off we go, and we respond positively to the Prime Minister's priorities. But for the last decade or so, the priorities have become increasingly horizontal. Issues like youth, or climate, or cities, or extremism, or inequality, or inclusion, or water, or HIV/AIDS. Issues that simply did not fit our 1950s architecture. They cut right across. We have no agency for climate. In fact, half a dozen, maybe 10 UN agencies have got a tremendously important contribution to make on climate change. We have no agency on youth. It cuts right across half a dozen, at least, if not more, probably a lot more UN agencies. Suddenly, our architecture became very much out of step with the demand coming from the market, from our client, from the Prime Minister, from the host government that was looking to the development system for help. And the Sustainable Development Goals really kind of revealed how out of step our architecture was, because the Sustainable Development Goals are profoundly different from the Millennium Development Goals in that they talk about these horizontal issues as well. They talk about climate, they talk about cities, they talk about water, they talk about access to justice and inclusion, things that simply do not fit our architecture anymore. So these reforms were about figuring out, how do we stay relevant? How do we stay responsive to today's policy priorities for our clients? Two options fundamentally. One would be to reopen the architecture, the whole architecture of the multilateral system for the 21st century, and ask ourselves, should we have an agency for climate? Should we have an agency for youth? Or is it, how do we best kind of structure ourselves? Tremendously costly politically as well as financially to kind of open that up. You open that can with, you know, you really need to know what you're doing and be prepared for the consequences. Or the alternative, which is the way we went, is to say, all right, we can make the system work on the ground where it matters. That's got to be where our focus is. Let's make sure that despite the fact that our architecture is pretty out of date with the demand, as long as we build the right systems, the right incentives, the right authorities, the right planning instruments, the right financing instruments, so that it pulls the system together to respond together on climate, to respond on youth, to respond on cities. If we can figure out ways of making the system come together at the country level, then we can overcome this, I guess, this handicap of an architecture which is pretty rigidly stuck in the 1950s. So these reforms were all about that, all focused on the field, on leadership, on instruments at the ground level to make sure that we stay relevant. And so they're all about delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals, absolutely fundamentally. So what you have up there was the 2016 QCPR, as that General Assembly resolution to make sure that the UN system makes these major changes, that it becomes coherent, more integrated because of these modern, if you will, these contemporary policy issues, that it becomes strategic, accountable, transparent, efficient, results-oriented, and so forth. So the business model for these reforms under the new UN development system, if we go to the next slide, please, Belayo, is essentially, if you look at the top on purpose, deliver on the SDGs and the value proposition. This is the what. What are we proposing to do? It's all about delivering on the Sustainable Development Goals, on leaving no one behind, on creating the enabling environment for the SDGs. And it's about doing it at the country level and at the regional level and at the global level. And how do we do that? If you look at the capacity, the resources, and the accountability, the reforms brought a major review of how we are organized at country and regional level and small island developing states, a relook at our resources, financial resources, but also our human resources at the country level to make sure that we're properly equipped, the right size to deliver on the expectations of member states. And thirdly, to make sure we have the accountability system, some way of enforcing and maintaining accountability around these changes so that we all are sort of heading in the same direction. Again, it's all about leadership, it's all about the country level, it's all about accountability to member states, it's all about focus on the Sustainable Development Goals. So in the next slide, very briefly, I just quickly describe some of the key components of this reform package. When you unpack it, you can see, and the coding of color is essentially that the green ones are all, if you will, already designed and in full implementation mode. And where they have an orange or a yellow, depending on your screen, these are ones that are still, somewhere in the process of finalization, so not fully fully off the ground yet, or still in the design phase. So let me just be very quick. First, we moved the RC system to the Secretariat. As Jens mentioned, we needed to recognize that to pull off this transition, firstly, you needed someone full-time to focus on it. Until now, the resident coordinator function was a part-time job. It was done by the UNDP representative, not on the side, but if you will, maybe with half of their time. They had to dedicate half of their time to UNDP and their responsibilities to manage UNDP. But also, because it was part of UNDP, of course, that meant that the representative, the resident coordinator, was also at the same time one of the operational entities. So moving the function out of UNDP into the Secretariat gave us a number of things. It freed up coordinators on the ground, and we have 129 of them. It freed up their time to focus on leadership, to focus on strategy. It also lifted them above the operational work. So it took them out of the business of raising money for projects and funding, and to really focus, to be able to focus on strategy, on advocacy, on communications, on constituency building. And thirdly, moving it out of UNDP into the Secretariat gave the resident coordinator access to the Secretary General, and now all of them directly report to the Secretary General. So this gave them the authority that comes from having that direct line to the Secretary General. So first step, move the system out of UNDP and into the Secretariat. A big, as Jens said, a very big lift administratively, but also legally, lots of complicated implications, but it went very smoothly, I think, in retrospect. Second, we needed to build up resident coordinators' offices so that our leaders could lead, and the strategies required to bring this architecture together around these priorities require human resources. So in every one of our resident coordinators' offices, we've put 5 professionals. For the first time ever, a strategic planner, an economist, a communications person, a partnership and financing person, a data and monitoring person. 5 professionals whose job it is to support the resident coordinator in bringing the UN family together. In the collective work, in the individual agency work, in fundraising, in communicating, in analyzing, with our first time ever to have economists in every single resident coordinator's offices. This is a massive change from the past. If you will, the typical resident coordinator's office in the past was one national officer and a part-time resident coordinator, remember. Now, every office has a full-time resident coordinator and a minimum of 5 professionals everywhere, irrespective of the size of the country, irrespective of the population size, irrespective of donor interest in that country or not. In the past, we had many big resident coordinators' offices, like I had in Kathmandu, a very big RC office, because the donors were willing to pay. But in most offices, the donors were not willing to pay, and it was very difficult for resident coordinators to really add a lot of value to country teams unless they were exceptionally talented. So the second component is this establishing of capacity in all these resident coordinators. The third was to establish a professional backstopping for all of this work. And DCO, the Development Coordination Office that I lead, again, was moved out of UNDP into the Secretariat and went from 46 people to 98 people in this reform, with 5 regional offices. So we moved our people for the first time ever out to the field so that they are in the same time zone as resident coordinators, because most of their work is supporting resident coordinators and UN country teams. A DCO that is able to manage these contracts, is able to hire, is able to analyze, is able to professionalize the experience, to move the lessons learned from one country to the other, develop new planning instruments, etc. Fourth, under these reforms, we introduced a new accountability framework, what we call the MAF, or the Management Accountability Framework. Because having that authority, as I said from the beginning, it's all about leadership and bringing the system together, despite the fact that we have architecture that is very sectoral, and despite the fact that each of the agencies have got their own governing board with their own accountabilities. So how do you get over those limitations on authority on the country level. What we did was we created a new framework where we laid out the relationship between heads of agencies and the resident coordinator. So today, every head of UN agency in the field, head of UNICEF, head of UNDP, head of FAO, their primary reporting line, of course, is to their agency and their regional director. But they now have a second reporting line to the resident coordinator. And every year, the resident coordinator is able to participate in their performance evaluation, which changes somewhat the relationship. And in that management accountability framework, we also adjusted many other small details, but very important ones about the sharing of information, about working inside our joint planning instruments and so forth. Fifth, we had to relook at the way we plan, the way we report. Many of you might have heard of the UNDS, the UN Development Assistance Framework. That was our previous planning instrument. We overhauled that. Sorry, someone's still typing and they're not muted. If you could mute your microphone. We overhauled our UN Development Assistance Framework and introduced this new cooperation framework, which is a major shift in approach from previously. It involves a much bigger emphasis on analysis. It brings in the economic dimensions of development much more strongly than previously. It is focused exclusively on the Sustainable Development Goals, really exclusively, with a laser focus on what is our contribution on the SDGs. It looks at it very differently at the way the UN system's offering. So it really puts a big emphasis on the convening power, for example, and policy advice, and moving away from, if you will, project management and that sort of activities level, which will not stop, particularly in fragile environments, say like Yemen. But the big focus we want to move towards is much more towards integrated policy advice to governments and using our convening power to pull together big investment coalitions to support this sustainable development goal. The new cooperation framework, which is all about analysis, which is all about policy and positioning on the sustainable development goals, and that allows a new accountability towards host governments, because now we provide a much stronger annual reporting to our host governments about what we've achieved around one common plan instead of 10, 15, 20 plans. Sixth, we had to overhaul the funding of the resident coordinator system. It had previously been heavily subsidized by UNDP because, of course, the resident coordinator was also the UNDP representative, so it was, it was mixed up with the salary of the representatives. A DCO was relying on different types of contributions from different donors. So the Secretary General established a kind of open, clear budget for the new RC system. It's a $281 million budget. He approached the General Assembly to receive assessed budget for that, but unfortunately didn't get it. So we have a hybrid funding formula, which I can explain later if anyone's interested in. But essentially, it's a combination of contributions from the system itself. So the agencies contribute towards the new coordination system, about $80 million a year. We have a new levy or a tax on particular types of projects that generates another $70 million a year, or should. And the remaining resources, so that the 130 million or so remaining, needs to come from voluntary contributions, today from 36 member states who contribute voluntarily to finance the system. 7, a funding compact. Part of this equation was a recognition that the way in which member states finance the UN development system can either make it more coherent or it can fragment it. Over the last 20 years, we've seen this explosion in what is called tightly earmarked contributions to the UN system. These are contributions where a donor is giving us specific money for a specific project in a specific country. And this is great, and we welcome that sort of funding, but when it becomes very large, as it has, $8 billion a year, it creates some fragmentation. It puts pressure on agencies to maybe move away from our collective priorities that we agreed 3 or 4 years ago, and to be tempted to sort of compete for new opportunities where there are lots of resources. So under the funding compact, member states, I think, extraordinarily agreed that where they were funding the UN system in this very earmarked way, they would also contribute an extra 1% of that money towards the coordination of the UN system, if you will, to offset the fragmentation that this sort of financing can have. And at the same time, they insisted, if we're going to fund you better, more money in core, more money in trust funds, less money tightly earmarked to projects, then we want to see you also improve the way in which you manage our money. And so on the UN side, we made a number of commitments to donors about reporting better around the SDGs, around more transparency in our audits, around efficiency gains, which I will come back to. 8, we introduced the Joint Sustainable Development Goals Fund, which is a financing instrument that is all about developing new muscles for the UN development system to support governments on the road to the Sustainable Development Goals. So far, about $150 million has come through the Joint SDG Fund. Its first round of financing was all about financing agencies that were collaborating around social protection, so that the policy integration required to support social protection. The second funding round was around integrating financing strategies so that we could support governments in raising resources for the Sustainable Development Goals. The third funding round will be about financing new financing instruments, experimental financing with the private sector, with public sector financing. So you can see it's all about developing new muscles that allow the UN system to kind of come in and deliver products and services that it hasn't previously done. All these pieces, these green pieces, have been implemented. For me, they're the key components of the reform, where we have finished our design work, where we are in the middle of implementation. The remainder are either still in design or in limbo, if I will, on the last one. Very briefly, multi-country office review was a commitment by the Secretary General to profoundly overhaul our support to small island developing states. So we put together I'm sorry, it's very noisy in my screen today. We put together a very ambitious, comprehensive upgrade of our support to small island developing states. More investment in coordination, more tailored policy advice, new planning instruments. This has been fully designed, heavily discussed with member states, presented to the Economic and Social Council last year and this year, and now we await the green light to implement, hopefully any day now. The same for the regional review, which looks at the 9,000 or so people working at the regional level for the UN system. Agency funds and programs, the famous regional economic commissions, and we asked ourselves, how do we make those resources, how do we use those resources more effectively for the Sustainable Development Goals? How do we get better at cross-border, sub-regional programming? How do we make sure that the country work done from regional resources is well integrated into our country strategies and doesn't operate in a parallel universe? How do we merge the internal coordination of our regional economic commissions with our internal coordination of the agency funds and programs? So you will have heard, if you've not seen, a set of recommendations that were led by Jens Wendell, in fact, to reform the way we manage our regional assets. That's also waiting for a quick decision, we hope, from the Economic and Social Council. Then we have the system-wide evaluation, which is a very important piece of this whole accountability framework. The Secretary General is very committed to improving the way we evaluate our work, in creating independent assessments of the quality of our results, and the need to stop doing it exclusively within our different agencies, but to start looking at it much more on an interagency basis. How are we doing on climate? How are we doing in Africa? How are we doing on reintegration or risk? And so establishing a stronger system-wide evaluation capacity is another key priority of the Secretary General under these reforms. And again, we presented to the Economic and Social Council last couple of weeks ago a simple proposal for a new team to support that kind of work. Last one, which is still really in taking off, is around the efficiency gains. The Secretary General, it's very clear, the more we work together, the more we collaborate, the more we integrate, tremendous opportunities become obvious in terms of improving our effectiveness and our efficiency. More effective as we pull our resources together, we provide better policy advice. More effective as we report in an integrated way, we give a much more accurate picture of the full impact of the UN's efforts. And more efficient in the sense that if we're able to share premises, share staff, HR experts, share vehicles where before we had previous ones, then we are able to maybe save some money and redirect that money away from administration into programming, into more investment for nutrition, into more investment for governance and so forth. So we have a big agenda in delivering major efficiency gains, and Jens touched upon that. And I would say it's still in the design, because it's a very, very complex piece of work, and I can expand on it if you're interested, but it's absolutely crucial to these reforms. And last but not least, something called the system-wide strategic document, which is an attempt at really at a global level to lay out what is the value proposition of the UN development system in the 21st century. What is our contribution vis-a-vis all the other development actors? Where do we see our comparative advantage? What do we want to be remembered for? What are the issues that bring us together, that glue the UN development system's response? The Sustainable Development Goals is, of course, the big compass headings, but it's enormous, and everyone can say the same. We all work for the Sustainable Development Goals. Our job was to indicate within that, what is the UN development system's contribution? And so we produced that system-wide strategic document, and it has been with the Economic and Social Council now for upwards of a year to get that approval so that we can really kind of proceed with that. So these are the main components of the UN development system reform. Most of them are now pretty much in implementation. The last remaining ones are literally, I hope, days away only of implementation, because we've finished the design work, we've finished a lot of intergovernmental consultations, and we just now need the green light to get going with full implementation. So what does success look like? Next slide, very briefly. You can imagine this is a long-term proposition. It's clear if we go to the top line, at the end of the day, success is about, firstly, much better policy advice. Look at that top line, success in the long run. Improved policy advice, integrated advice, SDG advice. Second, new programming results that we can deliver because we're working together in ways we've never worked before. How to get these synergies behind operations and programs like Generation Unlimited that UNICEF is championing, or ILO's Youth Employment Program. These are multi-sectoral, multi-dimensional operations. WHO's Global Action Program for Health. These require the whole UN country team to work together in ways we never have before. So second big success criteria will be these new programmatic results. Third, working across borders and sub-regional contexts more effectively than ever before. Harnessing those regional resources in new ways for the Sahel, for the Fergana Valley, for the Great Lakes, for the Lake Chad Basin. We can see many, many places where we need to work more effectively at the sub-regional level. The fourth, of course, is very concrete increased efficiencies with a budget attached to it, with a clear indicator financially of how these efficiencies and effectiveness translates into more money for programming. And finally, a better sense of accountability and transparency vis-a-vis the development system in our member states. That is our long-term success criteria. It takes years to get, it takes at least 18 months to 24 months, we've said, to get there, to really demonstrate that policy impact, to demonstrate that we're moving these normative frameworks forward and translating it into tangible results in people's lives. In the meantime, and I won't go into those now because it's now somewhat historical, we've introduced a lot of success criteria that are much more, if you will, the means towards the end. So better quality analysis, better hiring processes, more coordinated fundraising, a business continuity so that everyone kept working despite these enormous administrative changes in the way we work no one really noticed on the outside, despite the trauma, if you will, from the inside. So as member states, going to the next slide, how do you know anything will be different? We want to make sure that on the ground in your capital cities, ministries feel profound difference, that they can see and feel a change in the way in which the UN development system works. That they can see the UN system really converging around the SDGs, not 1,000 priorities anymore, but clarity about we are about the SDGs. Our indicators are SDG indicators, our priorities are SDG priorities, coming in behind the government. Second, that they see a resident coordinator whose profile and role has changed, has become the representative of the Secretary General, is no longer working on operational issues day to day, but really leading, strategizing, advocating, constituency building, pulling the system together, becoming a voice for the Sustainable Development Goals, bringing together the private sector, chambers of commerce, using that incredible convening power that the UN system has. We hope that your ministries, your counterparts can already see a change in the way in which UN agencies behave. Much less bilateral dialogues with planning ministries. Of course, nothing for the health ministry. WHO will always be their first and most important UN relationship. For the education ministry, UNICEF and UNESCO will be their most important relationship. That will continue. But for the foreign ministries, for the planning ministries, for the finance ministries, for the presidencies, offices of the president, they need to see a change in behavior where these coordinating ministries see agencies coming towards them much more together rather than apart. That there's a lot more policy dialogue between the UN system and governments of a high quality integrated conversation. And very importantly, that we start to see a lot more activities by smaller specialized UN agencies. Because up till today, we've not been very good at harnessing a lot of the policy expertise that we have in the UN system. Agencies like the Telecommunications Union, UNCTAD, the International Trade Center, the World Meteorological Organization. These are relatively small specialized agencies with no or very little field presence, but with a lot of things to offer, a lot of policy wisdom to offer. And these reforms are really designed in such a way, because it's all about policy, to make sure that we take advantage of all of our capacities, irrespective of whether they have an office in your country with a flag and a driver and a logo. That should not be the entry point for specialized policy advisors to be able to participate. And then maybe from a donor perspective, we hope they will be seeing at the country level a lot more joint fundraising, a lot more discipline amongst the UN system to focus on a few priorities, to say no maybe sometimes when money is available, but it doesn't necessarily fit our collective priorities. And finally, we hope very visibly already our counterparts, both donors and member states, host governments, are already seeing more high quality collective reporting from the UN system. Next
Robert,
slide. Yeah, I'll finish here, yes.
No, Robert, I would like you to take a question from Mexico, from
Sure.
Bill. It says, how can we support the reform at the country level? We have a great collaboration with the RC. How do we empower him, and support efficiency?
Thank you. So there are a number of things. Thank you, Mexico. I think the first is, how do you support? It's very important that a number of things. Firstly, we need line ministries to understand this larger kind of context. So there's a lot of communications involved for host governments, because the finance ministry gets it, the foreign ministry gets it, the mission in New York gets why it's important to have an integrated response. But it's very important that your health ministry and your agriculture ministry and your education ministry also understand that we're trying to move the system away from a sort of sectoral project management towards much more integrated policy advice around the SDGs. So you can help firstly by making sure that this new ambition, this new vision of you, the member states, for what you want from the UN development system, is really distributed and shared across your government system, so everyone understands why we're doing it. Everyone understands the role of the resident coordinator, understands when is time to talk to an individual agency, and when is it time to have a more broader dialogue, and how do you do that? So I think firstly, to get that the whole of the government acting in that way with the same expectations will help create incentives for the UN system to work. Second, I would say second is to really focus on our new development cooperation framework. We have one common planning instrument, one common reporting instrument called the Development Cooperation Framework. And we want all of government to come around that framework. We want our reporting to be all through that framework rather than individual sectoral or agency reporting. So second, I would say very important that a government shifts expectations in terms of planning and reporting, because it's all done, the planning is all done with your ministries, with your government. Very important that we collaborate around designing that new development cooperation framework, that every ministry is part of it, and that every ministry recognizes the legitimacy of the report that comes out of it, rather than insisting on some kind of dedicated, separate, sectoral reporting. I would say, finally, I mean, I could go on at great length, but in terms of efficiency gains, one very obvious area which we're hoping more governments will participate is to provide us with premises, is to contribute a UN house premises to the UN system. We are very keen. We can save money if we are sharing premises for a number of reasons. One of which is the more agencies you have in one building, it's easier to share vehicles and postal services and security guards, and it creates lots of synergies. We have a lot of experience. But it doesn't make a lot of financial sense if we're all paying rent on a commercial basis to some kind of real estate developer in downtown your capital city. Really, the economics of it only take off when we have a government contributed premises, a UN house, land and a building. That's when it starts to become really, you start to be able to save serious resources to be able to put into our programming and policy work. So I guess that would be one a concrete way in which you could help us directly. And Mexico already does provide all of the accommodation for the UN system in Mexico City. But if we could have more of that across the globe, we could also start to harness some big efficiency savings.
Thank you, Robert. Alan from Sierra Leone says, can you please further explain the hybrid formula of funding for the resident coordinator system? And also, do you think voluntary contributions are sustainable in the short term in light of the COVID crisis?
So, thank you, Alan. Briefly, $280 million is our total budget for the resident coordinator system. Of that, 3 windows. Window number 1 is $80 million, it's 77.5, but let's just call it $80 million, which the General Assembly imposed, if you will, on the UN system. The UN system has been contributing to the resident coordinator system for the last, I think, 5 or 6 years anyway, about $35 million. And the General Assembly decided to double that. So the UN system contributes from its own budget now approximately $80 million a year to the cost of the operation that I manage. And just to bear in mind, the operation I manage is 131 resident coordinators offices around the world, each with 5 professional staff, a driver, a secretary, and a resident coordinator, plus the 100 or so staff that work for me under the Development Coordination Office. So this is about 1,100 people altogether, spread across 130-something locations. So the agencies contribute 80 million. That is predictable. The agencies have been very good. They've all paid up their contributions for this year, and it's a very solid, predictable source of resources. The second is this 1% levy for coordination, which I mentioned. So 80 million interagency contribution. Second window, the 1% coordination levy on this category of cost-sharing contributions from member states. that could reach around $70 million in the very best case scenario. Today, it's only $30 million, but it's only the beginning. And we could probably reach somewhere at the very most, not probably, at the very most, we could reach around $70 million based on historical data of third-party cost-sharing contributions. We don't want that to grow. We want that to shrink because we want donors to move away from that kind of financing towards different kind of financing, which is better for the UN systems integration. So ironically, not only will it not grow, but we would actually, it would be a failure if it grows. We want it to shrink. But let's assume for the next few years, it's not going to change profoundly. So that's the second window, the 1% levy, and that's worth about $70 million in the very best scenario. So that leaves us with about $130 million missing. And that is the third window, and that is voluntary contributions. We have to go knock on the doors of every member state and ask them to make a voluntary contribution. Today, 36 member states contribute. We are really appealing to all member states to contribute at least something to your resident coordinator system. It's very important politically. And we are going to the General Assembly next year with a major evaluation or review of the story so far, and we hope by then we will have reached 100 member states contributing some money towards the cost of the resident coordinator system. However small, it is very important politically that we see your support for your resident coordinator system. But at the moment, 36 member states, and of course they include the usual suspects in terms of OECD, but it also includes Bhutan, it includes Bangladesh, it includes Thailand, it includes China, of course, India, so quite a few countries, Azerbaijan, other countries as well. So there are resources coming from the G77. It's not just the OECD sort of WEOG crowd, but 36 countries is not enough politically. Question, is it sustainable? Not in the long run, no. I would say, I can say that to raise $150 million, $130, $140 million a year from voluntary contributions is not a desirable funding model for the long term. It's working fine now. It'll work for the foreseeable future. But for sure, we need to have a discussion about whether you can sustain that for 5 years, for 10 years, or 15 years, or whether you just, you recognize that over the long run, something needs to give, but it's not, you don't need to deal with it yet. I mean, that might be a conclusion. But for sure, in the long run, it's a slightly precarious formula. And of course, the Secretary General recognized that, which is why he sought assessed budget for it in the first place. In terms of COVID, I think we are seeing, and that was my next slide almost, we are seeing the results of these reforms in the COVID response. Because what we have, and maybe we could just jump 2 slides ahead below, is we are seeing, and we've received a lot of very positive feedback from member states and donors about how the UN country team is responding on the COVID crisis. And it's got everything to do with the kind of leadership that we have been able to put in place, the kind of capacity that resident coordinators have. So in many countries, the first strategy around the economic and analyzing the economic impact of this crisis has been done with the economists in the resident coordinator's office, with the World Bank, and with the UNDP economists and so forth. But we've got new resources to do this analysis. So we've seen in COVID the value of a strong resident coordinator, and the value of how UN country teams can come together, whether it's on health or the socioeconomic or humanitarian around that leadership. We've been able to really demonstrate with the system a way that we've managed to integrate both the health response, the humanitarian, and the socioeconomic, bringing together the best of the system in one integrated package, even though each of those have their own logic, their own financing instruments, their own timetable and planning horizon, but they're all connected under one UN roof. under this COVID response, we've also introduced this idea of development in emergency mode. And so working closely with UNDP, but under the leadership of the resident coordinator, as always, we've really managed to introduce a fast track set of interventions around employment, small businesses, around social protection and social services like water and hygiene, that is done on a fast track mode rather than kind of in a very slow, kind of long-term traditional way. So many of these aspects have really come through, even though we're only 18 months into these reforms. So I think, if anything, on the one hand, the COVID experience has really strengthened the case for investing in leadership and coordination at the country level. Member states, whether you're a donor or a host government, are getting much, much better value for money, getting a better result from the UN system because of these reforms, because of this infrastructure, because of the resident coordinator system. Is it going to be, as budgets become tight in the post-COVID period, the next few years as we enter this deep recession, is it going to be more and more difficult for member states to find that $130, $140 million voluntary contributions? It might well, despite the fact that the case for it is stronger than ever before. And so we're going to have to just monitor that. But certainly, again, it's something we worry about, of course. I couldn't pretend that we don't.
Thank you, Robert. We have one more question that I would like to pose to you. It's Berit from Norway, and she asked, would it be useful to define flexible funding modalities at the country level more clearly?
I think that's a great question, Berit. Thank you. And I didn't realize you're in the crowd, because you really should be giving this lecture, not me. I think you are one of the institutional memories on the QCPR and these reforms. But so let me, with some humility, answer that question. I think, yes, we need to think about more flexible funding mechanisms at the country level. And it is our expectation that member states have put a premium on this new planning instrument called the Development Cooperation Framework. Member states have passed a resolution saying we want one primary planning instrument that brings together everything. We want that to become the primary planning, reporting, and performance management instrument. That does not mean that the individual agencies will stop their own plans. It does not mean we will stop having resources, most of the money coming through the individual agencies. Still, most of the money will always come through WFP, UNICEF, UNDP, through their own channels, of course. But surely it does mean that there is an appetite for putting some money behind the collective plan rather than the individual ambitions of the membership, of the individual membership. So we would really hope to see over the coming years a lot more interest in some funding of the development cooperation framework itself, rather than individual projects or individual agencies. And at the moment, about 30 country teams have these what are called pooled funding mechanisms at the country level to support their cooperation framework. And we hope by the end of this year, at least 100 of our country teams will have those pooled funding frameworks. They will never become a dominant financing instrument. They will always stay modest. But if they reach 10%, of the value of the country team's spending each year, that would be a tremendous achievement in terms of providing flexible funding that glues the UN system together around its common priorities, and therefore helps us pull together this integrated response. So lots more work to be done on that. Maybe I finish on my last slide, Jens.
No, Robert, I'm sorry, we're well over time. You're
sure.
Speaking time later. So
well, just if you could put up the last slide and you can look at it.
Please go ahead.
So this is just on the next QCPR. Sorry, one before that. And really just to say, with 4 big areas of anticipation. One is that you can use this next QCPR Obviously, to accelerate our work on the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to look at our programming instruments and our cycles. On the right-hand side is to make sure we reinforce the changes we've introduced under the previous QCPR. We need to make sure that all of these reforms stick. Third, on the left, bottom left, is to make sure the funding comes together. I talked about the funding compact. It is the most influential piece of this puzzle. If the funding comes together in an integrated way, the system will follow. If it keeps fragmenting, the system will fragment. And then finally, guidance, of course, on the policy side, on data, on transitions, on the relationship with the banks. I think that's the kind of key agenda for us for the next QCPR, bearing in mind that we've achieved a tremendous amount, I think, in terms of implementing the last one. And our focus for the coming years should really be on implementation and a bit less on design for a little while, just while we consolidate these changes. Thanks, and sorry for going too long.
Thank you, thank you, Robert. I think it's time now maybe to hear a little bit more on the experience of being inside the QCPR, as it were. And here I'd like to invite Margaret and Casper, but in that order. So Margaret, I'd like you to go first, and then I will take Casper. I hope that's okay. And Margaret, would you please take the floor?
Thank you very much, and good day, everyone. I thought Casper was going to go first, but anyway, we won't fight about that, the North and the South. I'm sure we'll complement each other by now. Yeah. Just to give you a little bit of a background as to where we were coming from with the 2016 QCPR. Remember, we were shifting out of the MDG mode into the SDG mode. And the MDG mode was more of a siloed, top-down operational mode. And then we were looking at how best from the post-2015 process that gave us the Agenda 2030 and also those SDGs, which had a more integrated approach to sustainable development and which dictated a sort of bottom-up approach. So in this context, of course, for most of us from the South, being program countries, our first drive went towards the UN development system, because that is the system that really helped and facilitated our development program. So of course we went to that. Then we sort of tried to study the system to understand where the system was at that point. And that became a tedious task. And so what happened basically is we also understood that at that juncture, we were not able to halt development to have a reform. So that's why I know Mr. Piper has been speaking about reform, but for us, we stayed away from the word reform, and we were speaking more to repositioning and fit for purpose, making the system more fit for purpose. Because we realized that there was no way we were able to halt the development activities to have any sort of reform. We were looking to see how best at this first stage we can sort of move the system a bit in a position where it could then respond properly or a little bit better to the new agenda which we have before us, which was the 2030 agenda. So in doing this, of course, in preparation for the 2016 QCPR, we had a number of processes that helped us. The ECOSOC organized what was called a long-term positioning of the UN development system, in which they had independent team of advisors who looked into the system and tried to give us some food for thought as to how we can adjust this, what we now believe to be this gigantic system that is very siloed. So there was that, and then the UNITAR played an important part also in you know, giving us some training to figure out some of the ways forward. These dialogues and trainings were geared to prepare, to provide a clearer understanding of the UN development system and its parts and all its functions. However, also giving us a little insight into the workings, challenges, gaps, and stuff like that. However, no part of the system was willing to step out and be a martyr to give us the sort of information we needed as to what was happening really in the system and what was, you know, what were really the challenges they were facing and stuff like that. We couldn't get the system to respond really to us. But however, you know, we kept our ear on the ground and we heard little whispers. So one of the major things that came out of what we heard was the fact that, you know, the whole system was complex and deeply rooted in a culture of siloed parts, competitiveness, and a bit of mistrust. And we also got the idea that UNDP had become sort of like a super agency that was really holding up the RC coordination system and being like a major part of the driving of the UN development system as a whole. However, as we try to dissect and go through to see how could we shift the system, we realized that because at this point we are targeting how to improve delivery on the ground, how to improve, how to get to that bottom-up approach. How are we going to be able to shift the system to respond to this bottom-up approach? So what we did then was we decided it was too complex to dissect. It was too complex to remove UNDP out of the picture, because what we realized also is that the RC and the office of the RC was basically more on a character-based kind of stuff. So if the RC seemed to be a nice person, you had more coordination on the ground, and that RC was able to gather the forces on the ground to do something more beneficial. However, other RCs were seen more problematic, and people stayed away and saw UNDP as maybe encroaching on their mandates. And, you know, there were all these dynamics that we figured out. So our main approach, therefore, noting the complexity of the RC system at that stage, was to leave the RC under the management of UNDP. That was the best we could come up with at that point, to leave the management of the RC under the UNDP. However, indicate that there must be a clear separation between the RC and the work of UNDP, meaning the entities work on the ground. The RC would have to separate himself from that. I know it's complex. We couldn't find another fix at the time. So we encouraged the UNDP to try to strengthen that firewall that they had and to try and make that separation between the RC and its resident rep. So that UNDP, if it had activities on the ground, should assign a resident rep who will take care of the entity's work and leave the RC to coordinate the UN the UN Development System coordination on the ground. So just to separate it a bit. And I think in noting that this was not really something that would be a sustainable and long-term practical thing, but just a stepping stone fix, there was born that mandate to the Secretary General to look into a better arrangement to accommodate this fix. So you know, and the SG did come back very soon with a response of that repositioning of the UN development system, which also indicated how the RC system would materialize. Also, we also looked at the UNDAF. It is now called the Development Cooperation Framework. It was the UNDAF, and apparently other people had a different terminology for it also. So we also looked at the UNDAF, and we thought that would be a good way in which the RC would be able to sort of bring the UN's work together in response to these priorities and mandates that the countries would bring forth. So no matter, and for us, there was also a push that you know, countries should deliver as one, because if you come and deliver as one, then the UN can respond to you as one. But I think for the countries of the South, it was important to not get into that engagement, but those who chose to deliver as one can go ahead. But if others didn't choose to go to deliver as one, then what we expected of the UN and the RC at this point is to take those mandates and priorities, however it's given from the country, and sort of formulate a response from the UN as to how they would facilitate. Because remember, the UN does not implement the 2030 agenda. That is, the countries will implement the 2030 agenda. But what the UN will do is help facilitate our implementation. So what most of us as program countries were looking for is the UN to sort of come back to us and say, okay, these are your priorities, and this is the way we see the UN system being able to help you. And another point of that, for us, importance was the fact that it wasn't just an agreement of the UN to say this is, but it was to get our buy-in also, that this is an agreement that we think this is a fair way to address our priorities and interests. So so for us, this was very important. Also on the ground, we decided there are various ways in which the UN services, and that's where the MCO came in. And we decided, well, seeing that we're looking at repositioning the UN, let's see if the UN is delivering properly through these services. And that's where the whole birth of the review of the MCOs came in, because some of the countries indicated that the service was not that great. And now, if it's not working from a top down where it's easier to manage, how then would you expect it to work from a bottom up approach, where you would be having, because the MCOs have, you know, some of them have 10 countries, some have 5, that one RC will be handling. So on a top down basis, it may be easier to handle, but on a bottom up, that may pose some stress. Then also we looked at the matter of the hattings for the RC. And for those of you who weren't involved in 2016, you may not understand, but what it is that the RC sometimes wore a hat of humanitarian according to the country's needs and priorities, had to wear the hat of humanitarian person, sometimes had to wear the hat of peace building, sometimes because of crises that were there. And that was a very difficult and fragile part of the negotiation, to try to walk the fine line of this, what we call the nexus, and the RC handling the nexus. So again, this was also looking from the scope of work on the ground and how we approach dealing with this. So I am sure this would be an issue that will come up again, and would be obviously a fine line we will have to continue to walk regarding that, because as far as from the program countries point of view, we see this must always lead back to development, no matter what it is. So it must always be looked at through the lens of development and improving sustainable development. Then we walked a little further on from the national level into the regional level, and we thought, oh boy, if we thought that the national level was complex, we don't even understand the regional level, you know, with all the different players and stuff. And obviously we realized that at the various regional sectors, they all were at a different development level. They were all doing different stuff. There was no sort of uniformity between the way they acted. So I think on that one, we sort of didn't delve too deeply into it, but just recognizing that it's an important part of the whole system, and also that it contributed greatly to enhancing the national work, and also to deal with the SDGs that are more regional and cross-border. So we did see value in having something done at that level. However, we didn't really have at that point the answers to that. And we also wanted to limit duplication and to improve overall efficiencies and those sorts of things. And out of this was born that that we asked the UNDG and the REX to basically have a look at this and come back to us. And also here, I think, is where the whole system-wide strategic document for us became important, because we realized that as member states who are to guide this system, we really did not have the sort of information on the system that would give us that insight and to really guide the system properly. So I think that's where that whole notion of having this strategic document, system-wide strategic document, to inform us more about how the UN works, how the different parts operate, and stuff like that. And I think that's why there was a bit of a pushback when we couldn't get the regional level off to a start. We were saying, well, how could you tell us how your whole system-wide system is working when some elements that are critical are still outstanding? So, so that was just to bring you in the context of today anyway. But then we got to the global level and we realized that it's very siloed, and we didn't really understand the UN Development Group, and you know, how was it really holding everybody together, and you know, what really was happening. Also, there was also the issue of reporting and transparency and stuff like that. So a lot of what to us, the 2016 QCPR was sort of building the first step platform for which we then could move better. And we're hoping that now we have passed the whole concept of the repositioning, or if you want to call it a reform, but getting the UN fit for purpose for the 2030 agenda and our implementation of the 2030 agenda, that we now see for 2020 that our movement needs to be more about development on the ground and not talking about shifting or fixing the system to work. We have a decade of action, of which 1 year now is out the door. Of the 10 years we have left, who knows, maybe next year may be also out the door, we don't know. However, so we need to have action on this. I know everybody's saying, oh, you're not going to talk about financing and funding. We did have a debate on that also with the North. The North was more into financing. We were like, no, it's about funding the system. And of course, we continue to impress that ODA plays a great part in this, and nothing will substitute for ODA. We appeal to our donors to meet their ODA, and we will continue to impress upon this. This is important. We do, in our debates, we did come around to saying, okay, the system can look for innovative ways in which it can sort of look for funding. And just before that, just to say that for us, core funding is the bedrock of funding the development system. It remains. However, we are not against non-core funding, but we believe that the non-core funding must be at least to address the priorities and needs that are identified by countries, or to give it some flexibility in which it can be used through the UNDAF or to address problems. So I think there may be a little bit of a difference, because sometimes the donors believe that they want, and we see merit in that, because it's easy if you say go to country A and give vaccines to everyone. The system would have to come back and tell you, okay, we were able to vaccinate everybody on the country. Then you can call the country and verify that everybody on the country was vaccinated. And we do see that the merit to having good reporting on your resources. And as program countries, we would like to know that the resources are spent to help us in our development, if that is the purpose of it. So I think sometimes we, instead of fighting each other, we need to see that we may be looking at the issue from different angles. However, the ultimate goal we both want to achieve. So I think, and then most times the person in the middle, who is the one who controls the funds, gets away in our argument with each other about which way to look at it. So, so yes, on that. And for us, our innovative financing does not include putting any money on Wall Street. So, we have to find innovative ways to fund the system, but we don't think stuff like that. And that's why I think we push back hard on this concept of financing the system. So basically, I think out of our sleepless nights and a lot of back and forth. I think, you know, looking back at the 2016 QCPR, I think it was a good starter. It was really a good starter to sort of address and to get the system in motion to begin to shift itself and really address this now bottom-up approach to the 2030 agenda. So I think I'll leave it at that for now. I think we need to, it also taught us a little bit that our mandates and our requests to the Secretary General and the Secretariat has to be very targeted, very focused, and very pointed, not micromanaging, but very clear, because we do see that some of the mandates that were given to the Secretary General were interpreted in different ways. I think maybe sometimes we put too much caveats and try to be too perfect to get everybody's side in, and we confuse the whole thing and make it sort of difficult for the Secretariat to get, and the Secretary General to get, a clear indication that this is what we're talking about.
Thank you. Margaret, you made that QCPR come alive. So now we have a report kind of a little bit from the New York trenches, okay? But Casper, you were there. I understand that you were also in the trenches, but some of the work was also coming from a kind of capital perspective, which is an integral part of the conversation that Margaret has just explained so vividly. So Casper, can I give you the floor?
Yes, absolutely, Jens. Thank you, and thank you also, Margaret, for presenting your perspective on it. As Jens said, I was based in my capital back in 2015, 2016, but from there closely followed the QCPR. But of course, I don't have as many good stories from the corridor as you do, Marco. But that's not a challenge for at least also participating with my perspectives about the process that we had at that time. I think both Marco and also Robert touched upon it, that the sort of the common backdrop to the 2016 QCPR was, of course, that the 2030 agenda had just been adopted. And then with the QCPR, we then needed to provide guidance to the system on how it should deliver and also be enabled to deliver on that agenda, meaning what did we as member states see as the needed adjustments for the system and the funds and programs so they could adequately support the implementation of the agenda. And Marco mentioned this as well, but I think we had three important building blocks going into the 2016 QCPR that I can also just mention. We had this row of dialogue meetings in the ECOSOC in 2015 and 2016, and some reports from these meetings. We also had a statement from the UN Development Group, and then third, we had the SG's QCPR report with a number of recommendations that included some, but not all the recommendations from these other reports. And I would say that the contributions from the expert group and the UNDG, in our perspective, presented quite different tracks and potential approaches to the future of the UN development system, where we saw that the UNDG contribution focused mostly on the work at country level. The expert group contribution focused a bit more on the coordination on a systemic level, for instance, also by proposing a further strengthening of the role of ECOSOC. So that means we had some recommendations that pointed towards further centralization and other recommendations pointing towards further decentralization. And I think the report of the SG then tried to balance these two approaches and had elements of both, in that it, for instance, proposed a strengthening of the RC system, more support for the delivering as one, and implementation of the standard operating procedures. And all of this to say, basically, that we had quite a significant amount of documentation going into the last QCPR, and then depending on your school of thought, several ways by which you could then guide the system in either of those directions. And I won't dwell too much about where we ended up in the QCBI. I think Marco already touched upon some of the issues from that. And we know also, for instance, how it actually led to then the SG presenting his reform proposals and member state deciding on the repositioning of the UNDS, which Robert also provided an update on. But perhaps I would then say a bit more about our approach to the process of the QCBI, because on our side from Denmark, as we always do, we decided on what we thought should be our priority areas that would guide our engagement to the EU's priorities and the EU's approach to the consultations. And in this respect, we were aiming at a QCPR that at the same time was to be both ambitious, focused, coherent, and clear. And when I say clear, I also mean when Jens made that remark about decoding UN language, to make sure that we have language which is understandable and easy. Someone just muted me. I don't know if I overstepped somehow.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. Please proceed. I don't know what happened. Just go ahead.
All right. But anyway, and then we hope that through that kind of approach that we would be able to address the bottlenecks for the system being able to deliver on the agenda. And one of the challenges back in 2016, the way I saw it from Capital, was that we fairly quickly experienced quite difficult consultations. I mean, delegations were quite far from each other in terms of the expectations for both the content and also the approaches for the consultation. So that meant that after 1 month of consultations, the at that time facilitator presented us with a quite imminent deadline for concluding the consultations. And that put a heavy amount of pressure on the process, as we had still not reached an agreement on quite large parts of the text at hand. And in my view, one of the reasons for this was that we didn't fully manage to utilize the first 2 rounds of runs through the text to go into, you know, the more in-depth text-based consultations. But we had quite a number of discussions about more principal character. And that meant that we actually ended up needing to establish a number of breakout groups. Marco mentioned as well that she was in one of those that dealt with some of the difficult parts in the QCPR. And that happened then in parallel to the main consultation. Now, in hindsight, I think that it was the decision to convene such smaller breakout groups that actually ensured that we managed to come to an agreement on the text in the end. But what I hope that we can also learn from the 2016 process is that we can actually take some steps to enable a smoother process than we saw back then. I think I will mention like 3 main issues. 1, to start early in our own internal thinking about priorities and fundamentals about what the 2020 QCPR is to address. And I think we've already heard both from you, Jens, and from Robert, some ideas there, but I think it's always good to get as clear guidance from the system as well in terms of what do they really see that the 2020 QCPR needs to be delivering. Second, I would also say that it's important to start early, reaching out to other groups and other delegations to learn about their expectations for the QCPR. That it just enables you to have a much better approach to the consultations once those begin. And then third, I would also say to consolidate your negotiation team, either whether you are a group or an individual delegation, and approach the consultations with a high degree of flexibility. And I know that can be very challenging at the UN, but while there may be those elements that one feels quite strongly about having reflected in QCPR, the ability to actually, during the negotiations, to consider alternative ways of framing or presenting that element in the text is, of course, a strong enabler for reaching an agreement. And I know that it seems quite obvious, and we say that in a lot of negotiations at the UN. But I think it's very important for especially also this kind of consultation. I think I will stop here at this point and then perhaps come in at a later stage.
Good. Thank you very much, Kasper. Well, I think we have a full package here of a presentation of really insights. So I'd like to open the floor and hear if there are questions that somebody will have. Maybe some of you were also involved at that time, or you start warming up for this time. But then I'd like, in a sense, to just maybe ask you then a question that maybe we could sharpen it a little bit and say, if you were to choose one thing that should be done differently, what would that be? And you can say at which level of the system. So I'll start with you, Margaret, and then you, Casper, and then see if anybody else would like to chip in.
I think where we were in 2016, because of the major shift, there was really not enough with the timeline we had to really do anything better. I think I alluded to it before. I think we really need to be very strategic in the manner in which we give mandates to the Secretariat and to the SG. It has to be focused, targeted, very crisp. No areas for gray parts. You know, I think we really have to be, if we are to have the sort of responses that answers our queries or responds to our queries in the way in which we want it to be, so that we don't have to have a second and third go at it, because I think we don't have that luxury of time. So we have to get it right. And I think it is time for both the North and the South to work on this aspect of it. You know, as they say, the devil is always in the detail. We may have the same idea of what we want, but then the devil lies in coming up with the language. So I think, if anything, that is one of the big things that, for me, I think.
But if I can paraphrase you, because Casper also came in, what you're saying is clarity between us as an ECOSOC, clarity on our expectation or our question to the UN system for change. That is very important. And what you're trying to say is also clarity means clarity. In other words, that it is, we come together as one and kind of make it clear. Is that a good summing up? It's a rephrasing of the point you were making. But do you agree with that? Yeah, good. I can see you're muted, but I can see you.
Definitely.
Yeah, and Casper, for you, try to think.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, I think that we've been through a very long process that, of course, started with this 2016 QCPR, and then we had GA Resolution 72279, and we've had the implementation process that has begun, right? And now we will have this QCPR that comes as the system is changing, and where we've heard, of course, that on some accounts one needs to be patient, on other accounts results should start to show, and we will then have the Secretary General coming back to us next year with his review about how implementation has gone, of course. But I think there is still, at least on my end, this thing about the structure that we have. Robert touched upon that as well, that basically where we ended up going is we want to focus about the delivery in the field. And that's true. I mean, that is where we mostly focused our efforts. But if you look at the governance structure that we have, for instance, here in New York, but also in terms of these new mechanisms that has been put into place, like the cooperation frameworks and so on, there's still something about, or some ambiguity in terms of the system that we have today, in terms of oversight, transparency, and effectiveness, I think. And what I won't be talking today about priorities for the 2020 QCPR on my side, or by the EU side, because that's a whole different game as well. But I think what's important is to say that we are now in an implementation mode. And what can we do in the 2020 QCPR to sort of reinforce the spirit of the reforms? How do we ensure that we get the best people for the RC positions, for instance? Are there anything that we can think of in sort of incentivizing the system even more to look at that? And then again, also on the language, to be absolutely clear on the side of us and member states, do we understand what the system is proposing to us? Because you also saw that in the consultations on the repositioning, that there were some of the reform proposals from the Secretary General that either member states did not fully understand or did not want to go with. It wasn't the full package that was adopted, of course. So I think it's important for the system to be clear to us about what they see as important elements, and then also for member states to be clear in the language that we put down, what we expect, when we expect it, how we expect it, and through which means we request and expect the system to do something. Because otherwise, vague formulations, of course, will also make follow-up actions difficult for us to measure and then hold the system accountable for in the long run. I don't know if it's fully answered your question, Jens.
No, but this is good, because if you're speaking from the experience directly, and you're speaking to what are some of the areas where, looking ahead, this is where we can do things and learn from what we've done. Ronaldo from Brazil says, could you share your thoughts on how the pandemic might affect the negotiations and objectives of the next QCPR? And that will be the last question for this round. Margaret, you go first, and then Casper.
Okay. I think before the pandemic, we had issues. I think what has emerged with the pandemic is highlighted all the cracks and gaps and challenges that the system has. So it's a real thing. It's something we have to address. But I think if we pull back a bit from it, we will see that this was in the making for a long time. We were not ready. We were not totally on the way to accomplishing everything by 2030 before the pandemic got here. So I don't want us to have the pandemic be our newest excuse, but we have to also step away and evaluate where we were going pre-pandemic, what's happening now, and what's going to happen if the pandemic is here for the next 9 remaining years bringing us to 2030. So I would say let's not focus only on that and make the next QCPR about the COVID-19. But what it alerts us about are some of the challenges that we may face going forward. This may not be the only pandemic. Hopefully it is, but it may not be. So how do we prepare ourselves and put ourselves in a better position to deal with this on that basis? So in one sense, I don't want us to just totally focus on COVID-19, but maybe we need to focus on having such bumps as we go along in the next 9 years, and how do we maneuver around them? How do we continue to put our foot forward to move on? And how can the system help us in a more coordinated way to deal with this? So that's what I will say on this COVID issue. Thanks.
Thank you very much. The way I heard you was very much the SDGs are still there. There's, even if we get kicked sideways a bit, or we said that we still have to focus on this, but also we should apply some foresight. We should try to see some of the scenarios that is ahead of us and understand. Kasper, what's your take on that question?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and I think there's two elements to it, right? Because there's the practical element, whether or not we will be sitting here on Zoom for the QCPR. I very much hope not. I hope that we will be able to have these kind of human-to-human interactions also in the corridor for the upcoming QCPR, because that's a very good measure in terms of basically understanding where everyone is coming from and why they propose different elements, so on. So that's one element. The second element is the more about the consequences of the COVID-19, which is probably that which Brazil was also mostly focusing on. Is in my view, I'm hoping that this COVID-19 pandemic will sort of be a disruptor in our approaches and falling back into old habits once we get into the QCPR. I hope that it can be a disruptor in that kind of sense for us, as I also touched upon, engaging with a greater flexibility in terms of let's focus on what are the key principles that we think are important. What are the main elements that we need to address? How can we make it clear? I hope that, and then whatever we turn out with will be something that when the system is looking at it also, it's a clear signal that we want to be building back better, and as we also say from Denmark, building back better and greener, so that we have the full dimension in terms of where we're going in terms of the 2030 agenda. And then again, also on when Margot mentioned earlier the funding and the financing discussion, I think the Canadian PR has mentioned it quite eloquently when we were also in the financing for development, that yes, absolutely there are elements regarding aid, but it's also important to say that, well, if we only focus on, if everyone was delivering on 0.7, those 4% of what is needed for actually realizing the SDG, we sort of lose track about the remaining 96%. So the whole partnership dimension about what can we do for having a more catalytical effect in the work that the UN is doing to sort of accelerate the progress needed. I think that's my hope, at least.
Yeah. Listen, thank you very much to both of you. I would like to move on to our last presenter for today. Ramesh, we have asked you to talk about the UNFPA, you can say, impact on the ground, the UNFPA business model, and your considerations. So please go ahead, Ramesh, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you for the invitation to participate in this dialogue, which was very rich and so many things have been already said. So I'm very happy to speak from the agency perspective about the repositioning on the ground, the focus on recent UNDS reform implementation survey, which we have conducted about our country offices, to kind of take the temperature and to see where we're going. And of course, before I proceed, the times of the COVID-19 indeed are the times of the challenge, times of the frank conversation, and if it's a good time for us to rethink what it is they're doing, how we're doing it, specifically when we talk about the results, the impact, and the value for money propositions, which are always essential to the UN reforms, right? We are now in the new reality, in the reality where the people are living under the lockdowns, in the reality of the world, where the major security threat to the nations does not come from a military invasion or over a sudden from an immigration, and we are now facing the reality that the crisis which we are facing and the major national security threats to the country comes from a systematic underinvestment in social goods and services, and specifically into the healthcare. But this crisis is also the crisis of the poverty, is the crisis of the development. And if we are were to run the analysis of the economic investments and the financial investments investments which are made in various areas of both at national level and internationally, we would see that there was historically a very little attention, or much smaller attention, which is paid to those social sector areas. So within this context, the resident coordinators are very important interlocutors of that dialogue, or if you want to say of that repositioning. And I would like to circle back to what Robert was saying in his presentation. It's amazing that now we have an economist in every RC office who is working there to support us to articulate the economic arguments around the agenda and how we can carry forward this. But I'll speak a little bit more about that as we move forward. Just to say that RC coordinators are already proving themselves as leaders and those interlocutors. And let me proceed. Next slide, please. So at the end of the year, I'm talking about 2019, we had run a survey of our country offices to collect feedback on early experiences within UNDS reform implementation. And overall, we had 112 country offices which have responded, and that constitutes an 87% rate of the responses. The survey is centered on several focus areas, specifically as implementation of the management accountability framework to which yourself and Robert have referred to, but also on the strategic engagement with the resident coordinators and country teams, common country programming and reporting, common business operations, UN funding, and financing for Agenda 2030. And that's what I will focus on. The survey also was designed to collect experiences, challenges, bottlenecks, and opportunities as they emerge. So please, if you can go to the next slide. As you would see from the agency perspective, UNDS reform is viewed as a positive change because it provided for us with a strategic opportunity to position the normative issues more centrally as we are at the kickstart of the decade of action to deliver SDGs. As we are still in the early stage of implementation, more time, of course, needed to assess the full extent of the impact of reforms on the programmatic results. But these graphs represent quite a positive change in a number of in the level of engagement and intensity of engagement, and in the type of the engagement. For instance, the empowered role of RCs as the spokespersons for the entire UN country team, together with the additional capacity of RCs offices, provide greater opportunity for advocacy for normative issues and create a space for large engagement and convergence, specifically around those issues which UNFPA focuses on, and that's women's empowerment and social development. One example here in fostering the strategic dialogue around the agenda is the support we have received from the UN resident coordinators around the Nairobi summit conducted in November of the last year, and the mobilizations that they were able to rally both the national governments and the civil society in support of that major conference co-sponsored by governments of Kenya and Denmark, and obviously supported by more than 150 member states have participated and in the Nairobi summit, and made a lot of volunteer commitments towards development of the attainment of the 3 zeros, which are at, as you know, zero maternal mortality, zero unmet need for family planning, and zero gender-based violence against women. The 3 transformative results we're focusing in support of the SDGs. So if we move forward to the next slide, we will see that we also have actively participated to go with UNESCO in co-led development of the new cooperation development framework. And we do believe that as we invested ourselves heavily in the work of the UN SDCF results group, we also led in the areas of data, youth, GBV, and MNE in various country offices. And you could see from the graphs which you presented that the participation was quite active and well distributed within the sectors. Of course, we see that there's groups are currently created, those interagency groups focusing on the areas where agencies work together, currently providing a space for both analysis, dialogue and collective support to the national priorities. There is a need, however, for a greater technical support, specifically around financing and SDGs financing, and that's where I really do appreciate what was said about the economists and making the investment case, because fundamentally, as we speak about the COVID-19, when we talk about the structured funding dialogues, which are organized in various ways within the agencies, we also have to be able to put what is first and where the UN system's value add is the first. And obviously policy, formulation of the solutions, and the dialogue around the targeted investments to trigger the change are very important. Because let me just use the parallel, COVID-19 is a time of frank talks. A $2 billion is a benchmark, for instance, for a mid-sized agency. That is also as equivalent of a total budget of an annual budget of one hospital in North America. So, and yet these agencies are supposed to bring the global change and drive the results. So you cannot here underestimate the importance of the policy dialogue, the importance of the identification of the solutions, and the analysis and the data, which are those important instruments, and that the RCs are leading the common assessments and driving towards those triggers of the change. So can we go to the next slide? Thank you very much. Here we are talking about joint funding and common business operations. Again, we have seen quite a good improvements here. We could state that UNFPA country offices are increasingly engaging in UN joint and pool funding mechanisms and SDGs financing discussions and initiatives. There was recognition that there's, of course, a room for improvement of both counts. However, we already benefit from long-term agreements, LTAs, signed by other UN agencies. The business harmonization procedures and mutual recognition is in progress. Success stories here are common premises and common services, including travel agency services, security guards, translation services, and utility support services. And of course, mutual recognition principle is already there. So we are working towards increased harmonization of financial and our operation system, policies and procedures, and obviously working with UN sister agencies also on our ERP platforms, and those are also of the joint nature. I will speak about a little bit more about that later. So can we proceed, please? Now, carrying forward the UNDS reform is first of all, for us as an agency, is to be active at all the levels. First of all, continuing its leadership and engagement in implementing of UNDS reforms for partnerships with the country teams, and focusing on specific issues. For instance, small island development states, middle-income countries, and multi-country offices are a very important area of joint cooperation. Here we are investing in common premises, in common shared positions, in common staffing, and joining the forces in addressing the needs of the SEEDs and multi-country offices, while putting an emphasis also on the national pool of cadre, which is a very important element, and capitalizing on the national capacity. We are continuing our leadership at the regional level through issue-based coalitions and regional collaborative platforms, those which are endorsed and supported by the member states. And we believe that the next QCPR presents an opportunity for the member states to provide guidance on how UN development system should work, what kind of integrated policy and programmatic support should be provided to countries to accelerate SDGs implementation in the context of the COVID-19. I already emphasized the integrated approach to data and evidence, which should at all times be coupled with the thought leadership. Robert had mentioned the UN specialized agencies, and it's important to harness that knowledge and that technical expertise and bring the solutions, the economic solutions and investment case solutions in the convergence with the thought leadership and forward-looking approaches, which are required to bring bring the change about. A lot of the recent years was about the orchestration, about reorganizing, and that was mentioned. I don't want to revisit that. It is the time now for us, as I said, the orchestra is down there, but we need to hear the music and we need to play the music. And that's where the actual best of the UN system is to come from that cooperation and use of the technical resource and the knowledge and the thought leadership of the specialized agencies in combination with the RC system, which brings together the elements into an actionable, convertible, actionable agenda on the ground. So if we can go to the next point here, that's about our business model. And amongst several offerings which we made to the previous QCPR dialogue, one of them was our diversified country presence, meaning not doing everything in the same place, but being diverse in our approach to what it is that we're delivering at the country level. Our business model consists of 4 elements: what to do, where, how, and who. On the what, I believe many of you have participated in our discussions. I mentioned 3 transformative results, and this is what UNFPA is doing in support of the SDGs, ensuring universal access to sexual and reproductive health and rights, and making sure that no woman is subject to violence, and that the family planning is supported, and all preventable maternal deaths are averted. When it comes to where, we recognize the difference of the national context, the needs. In many countries have been in a different stages. Some of them have met partially some of the targets, some of them have not. The income issues are obviously availability of national resources, but also the income issue is not the only one, because very often inequalities and poverty are masked. And I will, in the next slide, explain how it works in our model. Now, how to achieve the impact? We also have our implementation strategies, which varies from all range of delivery of social goods and services into generation of evidence, policy advocacy, and South-South cooperation. And then who? And the role of the organizational structure and partnerships in implementing the program agenda and the business model. So if we can go back to the next slide, I will unpack it a little bit more in detail. So here you could see the world through the eyes of UNFPA, and basically a color-coded model. You will see that in that diversified approach model, we have 5 modes of engagement. Those countries which have the most difficult economic situation, and where the classification of the country is the poorest, and you have the lowest possibility to address, the core resources of organization are being used to implement all 5 core modes of engagement, which vary from service delivery, which is support the actual delivery of goods and services, including health services to population, with capacity development, which is large-scale training programs, knowledge management, generation of knowledge, advocacy, policy dialogue, and obviously South-South cooperation and South-South and triangular cooperation and partnerships, and broad partnerships is an extremely important mode of engagement. Now, the income is not the only factor in deploying the diversified model. We are actually using the disability adjusted life years in addition to the income of the countries to determine, and that's specifically for the disability adjusted life years, specific for the maternal health. That is something which is supported by the Global Burden of Disease project led by University of Washington and London School of Economics, and is an adopted methodology by the World Bank and many other partners. So what we do here, we using gender inequality index factor in births attended by skilled personnel for poorest quintile of the population. So what happens in this particular case is that in those countries which are in most difficult situation, we maintain large presence offices, and 60% of our resources are targeted in those countries. Now, as we move from one quadrant to another, we flexibly deploy other modes of engagements while we restrict the service delivery to the red quadrant. But what we support more actively is capacity development, knowledge management, advocacy, policy dialogue, and South-South cooperation contextualized to the context of the countries. And obviously, as you move to a more advanced development situation, we also have we reduce the number of our staffing, we consolidate our offices, we delegate authority, and we capitalize more on national staff, on the senior national experts who are embedded in the RC offices and who provide UNFPA's expertise and advice to an integrated approach. So in a way, this is quite an advanced, and for instance, UNFPA strengthens its representations in countries that their representation is not commensurate with the level for the high level, for instance, political engagements and relations with donors and resource providers. That's also important. However, the major heavy focus is targeted on the countries with low financing capacity, high need, a high inequality, and the whole shift is being made towards a policy dialogue and engagement through the national staff in those contexts. We also have introduced a transition to a senior national staff at the title of the head of office to enable them to engage directly with the RC system and play that important advisory role and support role to UNFPA programs, right? And also it speaks to a larger national ownership, and maybe something which is not in my slides, but then the basis of the delivery of the entire system is based solely on national execution. UNFPA very randomly uses international organization for delivery of programs in this context. I'm almost finished. I am aware of the time. So moving forward, what do we need more? And that's probably where I would like to finish. We need collaboration, agility, and impact. And that's where the fourth leadership is very important. We have provided, as part of our push for the decade of the change, assessment of all the cost and financial gaps for the 3 transformative results in support of the SDGs. And that was the first exercise in the UNDS system. We worked very closely on this methodology with academic consortia and with WHO, and we are offering this now as a tool for the UN resident coordinators to be used in developing a national domestic cases of what it is required for the next 10 years to achieve this transformation within the context of SDGs, so that every country will have a case where you have a methodology driven good economic scientific case which tells you what investments are needed and what are the critical areas where you need to invest to make that change. And then we embed it in UNSDF and we move that forward. That creates a space of for the advanced analysis, which is important to do that. And that analysis only can be done together, breaking down the silos, starting the silos with data and systems, but then using the UN resident coordinator system to advocate with the national authorities for the investments which need to be made, by also bringing the other stakeholders, the private sector, and of course the donors, to bring that desired change, specifically in the context of the COVID-19, as I said, as we have looking at systematic underinvestment in the areas of social development, health, and protection. And then we look further investment in the ecosystems of collaboration. And the ecosystems of collaboration, I dwelled a little bit on that. This is with the working groups. This is what is created around the UN SDF, where we come together and we can work on the common solutions, because it shouldn't be, and it is not anymore that, you know, UNICEF and we only work on vaccination, and here is the violence issue, and please don't touch it because nobody else is doing violence and I'm doing the violence, and so forth. You know, I come from an agency where before the previous strategic framework, we used to have 15 outputs in our strategic plan, which is not the case anymore. And that was just because we had 15 section chairs. You know, so you break this silos from within, but you also break it from within the system. And it's important that we converge around those ecosystems together to drive that change forward. And last and not the least, something I know that Jens is very close to your heart, is the intelligent automation in our ERP systems. Because even now we're interacting through the Zoom environment. We're talking, they're denying the limitation of the physical communication through this technology, but that technology is available for so many other things. So together with the UNDP, we are moving now into an upgraded intelligence-based ERP system, and other agencies are joining us as well. And we're creating an ecosphere of communication around intelligent automation tools, which should better enable us to do knowledge sharing and result-based management and making decisions using the real-time data. Because I know what we all want to hear, both the governments on both sides of the partnerships want to see more results, want to see more impact, and we need to be more adaptive and more agile. And that only can be done by real-time data. The only thing I ask, and I repeat, this is a place, there are all these successes and there are errors, but even then the errors are there, these are good, because you have to learn from failing and moving forward with a better impact oriented. So I think those three pillars moving forward will be very important, and all of it lays in fundamental merger of intellectual leadership and operational delivery capacity, which we have on the ground, joining forces together to give the best of the UN system. And that's where I would like to stop. And thank you very much. If there's any question,
thank you very much. I just have one question before I open up. On your last slide, on the left-hand side, you have a very nice color-coded map. And I'm still, can you just explain what is the red, what is the purple, what is the yellow on your map?
Oh, absolutely. This is the color coding of the map goes with the four groups of countries. The color code, the red, goes for the countries which have least economic development, but where also we have the highest levels of maternal mortality and unmet need for family planning. Then orange countries represent those who have transitioned, and this is not just an economic classification, it is a combined economic classification overlaid with the data on maternal mortality and actually overall burden of disease among particularly thinking of women. And then the rest would follow the same logic. So as the situation improves, you basically have four color quadrants. For the next cycle, we are actually thinking of, specifically within the context of LNOB, that we will continue to, within the context of the global advocacy and normative role, of course, communicate with everybody. But then it comes to the actual delivery of the targeted program, specifically funded from the core resources. This is where the SDGs will be decided. And that's what will break. And I actually wanted to bring attention to the last slide, if possible.
Yeah, we're running out of time, Ramesh.
I know. It's just one. Well, I just want to show it. If that can be, next slide could be shown. And that's what I was thinking, and that's what I concluded with: impacts, agility, and collaboration.
Very clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
First, I'd like to open the floor on Ramesh's presentation, and I would just like to see if there. Good. Then let us move to, in a sense, it's not the ECOSOC, but nevertheless we can move to the general debate. And here I would like to start with Eric from Belgium. Eric, you have raised the question. Core funding has been crucial in allowing a rapid response. How do you reconcile that with the calls for funding for specific UN entities or collective responses? Robert, I would like to ask you to see whether you want to start with that question, and then I'll, for short remark from Ramesh, and I don't know if Margaret or Casper wants to comment on it, you're welcome, but I think it's directed to the UN members of the panel. So Robert first, and then Ramesh. You got the question?
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I heard the question, and I think I'm absolutely correct. Core money is by far the most flexible money, and it allows us to respond fastest. So there is no question about that. And the better the balance of core resources we have, the faster we can respond to these types of situations. So 100% correct. But I don't think it is exclusive. So I don't think it's a zero-sum game. And we certainly do not want to demonize a kind of non-core resources for funds and specific agencies and programs. There's a time for, there's certainly a time for non-core or extra budgetary resources. And we recognize that having those resources sit collectively with donors and then be allocated at times of crisis or behind big themes makes sense for us as well. And what our preference, of course, is that rather than it coming very tightly earmarked, that you give a bit more agency to the UN system in allocating those resources to where they are needed most. So pool funding, these vertical funds, thematic trust funds. These are the best kind of non-core resources. But and just to say very clearly, we certainly do not want to demonize non-core resources. They are absolutely crucial to our success. But in balance, we do need to have sufficient core that we can respond faster. So they complement each other if they're done right. But there's great non-core and there's less great non-core, if you will. I think I'll stop there. Yes.
Thank you, Robert. Ramesh, do you have any question on this?
Well, I think Robert
Answer.
said
Sorry.
it. Yeah, he answered that question very well. And yeah.
Now let me just jump out of my role and just add that, as Robert has eloquently explained, there are a number of themes where the UN has to act as one, and there, when that is the case, then clearly the pool financing option is a very attractive way. And I think you both touch upon it, Ramesh, also in your presentation. But that is optimized for multi-agency action, and while core is of course very important for agency action. Let me stop there and then ask if there are any other questions at this point.
Can I just make an
Yes, of course. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for all the presentations today. But it would be remiss of me, being the chair of AOSIS, not to again point out that MCOs are not synonymous with SIDS. There are parts of the MCO who are not SIDS, and there are SIDS who are not in MCOs. And therefore, if we are going to address issues of SIDS, we need to really do it. And we do appreciate the movement of the Secretariat to address issues related to SIDS. However, it cannot be contained within the MCO. It's unfair to the non-SIDS members in the MCO, and vice versa, it's unfair to the SIDS. It's not clear if those recommendations or proposals towards SIDS applies to SIDS outside of MCOs. So just to make that, because I think going forward, we would need really to address this so that we address SIDS more in its collective home and not under MCOs. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
May I intervene also on that point?
Yes, Ramesh, please go ahead.
Yes, and I think what Margaret said is very, very important, and specifically within the context of, you know, the income is often masquerading the poverty, and also the inequalities from the win are ones of very important issues to be addressed, and that is specific to the Samoa Pathway region, but also to the Caribbean region specifically, where we have a lot of middle-income countries, and they appear as the middle-income countries. But once we look at the details of what is happening at the country level, and we also see the dependency of the economies on the certain areas which are now so much affected by the COVID-19, that we somehow need indeed a deep reflection as part of the new QCPR, where we are doing enough, where we are going far enough in terms of bringing the reality to the table and continuing to provide those assistance, because that goes all the way to the issues of centrality. But let me also bring to the discourse also other matters. For instance, we are seeing what is happening these days, and the sensitivities and how people are reacting to the issues, let's say, of leaving no one behind throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. If you look, for instance, at the issues of Afrodescendientes and the way of exclusion in social and economic development, which we are seeing in Latin America and some other parts of the world, how do we reach out to that? How we make sure that they benefit under the diversified models also from the services and from the support that are required. So one size here does not fit all. I fully agree with Margaret. And MCO model is just one of the ways of engagement with a few countries, but it doesn't answer the question. It doesn't provide the solutions. Solutions lie beyond of those things, but we need to address all that as we move forward, because these are also the areas where we need to move the last mile in order order to leave no one behind and actually address the issues in a more holistic way, where we don't see it as one size fits all. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Ramesh. And then we have Diego raising the question around technology. The GSTR recognizes that science, technology, and innovation is a lever for the 2030 agenda. And then he points out that the SG presented last week his roadmap on digital cooperation. And here he considers, for example, the role of RCs, what they will do, be asked to work with host governments, etc. The tenet of his question is, against this backdrop, how do you see the issue of digital technologies in the upcoming QCPR? So here I would like to start with my colleagues. And for once, Casper, I'll ask you to go first on that question, but I will ask all four panelists to answer. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. No, technology and innovation absolutely is very important in our development cooperation. And, you know, from our side, we've been supporting, for instance, the 4 New York-based funds and programs with dedicated support for their innovation activities now for, I think, 6 years. And we've seen, for instance, where that has taken UNDP and their whole approach to development going forward with the new accelerator labs, which is very, very interesting. And I think it's definitely something that we need to reflect upon, because how can we leverage technology, for instance, in the way that we do development on the ground? How can that act as a catalyst, for instance? So I think that should be part of the conversation somehow. And when I saw the question, I also just thought about the annex to this year's QCPR report from the Secretary General. There was an indicator there that also spoke about, you know, the quality of available data that RCs have, and where I think that on large accounts, the impression among the RC was that available data was actually going down in terms of quality. So I think that's also something that we could reflect upon.
Thank you. Then I would like Ramesh, and then Margot, and finally Robert. But Ramesh, any views on this?
Well, I think we need, knowledge sharing and what works. This is what is absolutely important. What works, the proven solutions, and our ability to react to the changes in the real time. And I would like to link it to the pool funding, because the results are not individual, they're common. They're common results for the system. And pooled funding is an ability to drive those results. And of course, core elements, we spoke about that as well, they're absolutely indispensable. But bringing back it, for instance, to the perspective which Margot provided on the specific applications, we need to know what works in every particular context. We need to know what is the nationally appropriate solution, and we also need to cross-fertilize. South-South cooperation here is very important, because some countries might have made progress in the similar context, but that not only comes from that. There is a need to investment in research and evidence, and then bringing a convergent knowledge, not some sort of a fraudulent knowledge, but the one we can evaluate in real time, where we can see whether it works and we can fine tune. And that's the type of the things I see happening at the country level, and I see it. The pool funds is an ability to drive for it, not to be substituted to the core funding, specifically to the volunteer-funded organization who have no assessed contributions. And then also partnering around those innovative ideas and new solutions with their unusual partners, because not necessarily you can find all the donors interested in specific places, but there are ways of coming that, individual giving, private sector, ability to fundraise, use of the social media, use of the social communication means, alternative approaches to both to the data collection and participation, and capitalizing on youth. All that what comes in mind, time is too short, but bringing it in one package, that's what is essential. And above it is our unity around the results, our unity around what is the transformative change and the knowledge we're using, and our unity around the funding stream associated with that as very, very important for the future. Thank you.
Oops. Margaret, can I ask you to come in, and then Robert? There is already a new question from Garfield from Guyana, which is also in the same area, but of financing. But let us finish the technology first. So technology digitization in the new QCPR. What is your view?
Thank you. For me, you know, I think the SG raised this is about inequalities. We are not on the same page. We are not on the same level. We are not starting at the same point. So it becomes difficult for us to assume that those furthest behind, and that's who we're supposed to be targeting in our, you know, movement towards implementing the 2030 agenda. We're supposed to be targeting those furthest behind. And this, again, puts us at a disadvantage from the onset. So unless we're able to leapfrog those who are furthest behind to get to some level playing field, then we will always have the upside down of it. It would work for some, but not for all.
But you mean that specifically, I mean, it's a general point, but you mean this applies to technology too?
Yes, and access to the internet. It may be something everybody in America or everybody in the northern states have access to it, but it is not something that's common in a lot of places. And we have to realize this, and we have to have some in between and work with the various levels of development and how we will deal with it.
Very good. Thank you. Robert, please.
I think I would just focus on one aspect of this because people have covered the main points, which is that the future country team has increasingly got a larger virtual presence. And I think this is absolutely critical when we think about the COVID experience. We're still stuck in a mindset that, you know, it's all about being resident to be a player. And there's a problem there. One is that it's not efficient. The two is that we've got a lot of, the more we go towards policy work, the more we're going to need to, you know, find specialists that aren't necessarily resident. And we can't afford to put resident specialists in every country. And three, a lot of that policy expertise in the UN system is with specialized agencies that don't have a field presence. So we need to move away. We need this issue of digitization and technology. For me, one of the crucial ones is to kind of leap into the 21st century and recognize that sort of residency as a prerequisite to be and considered a serious active participant in the development process at the country level is an obsolete model. We need to accept that. I mean, agencies need to come to the country. Don't get me wrong. You can't do all your work virtually. But you can participate in the planning and the advocacy and the reporting. You can be part of the policy dialogue up to a point from without necessarily being resident. And I think that's a big shift in the new business model, and it will open up lots of access to specialized agencies who at the moment are not sufficiently integrated into our country level work. And that means less value for money from member states.
Thank you very much. Ben Garfield, as I mentioned, from Guyana, asked, in the focus on country level conditions, what role, if any, does per capita income play in providing assistance in the new development approach? And if I may paraphrase it, also in the new QCPR. Margaret, I think you have been in over this already, but I'd like to bring you back in and just elaborate a little bit more. Where do you think we should be taking this? And then Casper, I will take you in next. But Margaret, you go first on this one. And then there's a question directly to Ramiz about a slide. Please read that question, Ramiz, in the chat. So when the floor is yours, you can also respond to GLE at that time. But first, Margaret, please go ahead. And
well, I would definitely like to yield the floor to hear from others on this.
Okay, good. But okay, but I'll come back to you then just for a very brief closing remark. But Casper, please understand this may be the last time round you will be given the floor. So try to answer the question and then offer any other closing remarks you may have. Casper, you have the floor.
Okay, well, I'll try then. I mean, yes, of course. We have said on many accounts that we need to target vulnerable communities, leaving no one behind, prioritizing LDCs. So of course, income level will play a role, but I think that Achim Steiner has also mentioned that if we're looking towards the future, we will see many pockets and many vulnerable groups will be in middle-income countries. So of course, we need to figure out, well, how can the UN development system then target their interventions to also ensure that they have those groups in questions. I think that's something that we need to figure out. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say at this point on that question. And concluding remarks as such, well, no, I just basically what I also said earlier. I think it's important when we move ahead that we do this with an open mind in terms of what other delegations are bringing to the floor, thinking about being concrete, specific, clear in where we go, and that's it for now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kasper. And then Robert, what is your take on this?
I think I can quote the Secretary General. I mean, he's very clear that our framework is obsolete. This focus exclusively on GDP per capita just completely overlooks some profound variables like vulnerability and risk to factors like climate change, which are not of the making of a country like Barbados or Fiji, or Vanuatu. So I think there is an appetite to profoundly revisit these issues of eligibility and criteria, at least from many actors, including the United Nations, and we will be a champion of that. And our future leaders in small island developing states will be articulate ambassadors for this. Believe me, this will be a big part of their job description. But the job, how to fix that, is a conversation that needs to take place here in ECOSOC, in the second committee, in the OECD DAC, I guess, in particular. So the battle must be joined, as they say.
Thank you very much. Ramesh.
Thank you very much.
Close that question, but a specific question from China also. Please go ahead.
Yes, it's on the issue-based coalitions. First of all, of course, we, as I noted, we are quite actively participating in the processes to develop and to define the functions and governance of the new regional collaborative partnerships as the new way of working. And this of course speaks to the issue-based coalitions. For instance, in African region, to bring an example, several consultative meetings we have convened together with the system of agencies, funds and programs, and of course Africa Regional Economic Commission. UNFPA specific vantage point or the strength is in statistical systems, in data, in bringing evidence to the table in the discussion. So in Africa specifically, we have agreed that opportunity on issues-based coalition will serve as the main vehicle for delivering integrated technical support to the region, depending on what are the specific needs in specific subregions or the countries. So, and we are playing a role of the convener on the strengthened integrated data and statistical system for sustainable development, alongside together with the Economic Commission for Africa. And there's a group also on harnessing demographic dividends, gender and youth development, which is where we're actively involved in the work of. So I think these are the specific examples of how we're driving it. And obviously each agency brings on the table what is the strength. And in our particular is converging around the data and bringing the evidence on the table in order to guide the action. Thank you.
Just a little bit, Ramesh, on the issue of the role of GDP. I think you've been there. You have talked about but anything else you want to add?
On the GDP, I do believe that historically there was much more attention which was paid to this as a part of the GDP, and moving forward, we were the first ones to introduce, for instance, disability-adjusted life years, because we felt that purely GDP does not make a justice to the classification of the country or determination of what sort of an assistance should receive. So the actual situation, the mask poverty and disability adjusted life years. Moving forward, we probably need to be more. That's why I mentioned the pooled funding. While thematic trust funds, you need to find groups of investors who are interested in driving the change, and you need to bring them together. For that, you need evidence. You need evidence of the poverty where it exists and the pockets and how to address it. And what are population groups we're working with. And that might be indigenous, that might be Afrodescendientes, that may be many other different groups, you know. That one we need, and we need to make them statistically visible. Second, we need to know what works. I spoke about that. And the third, we need to have a coalitions of the like-minded, which needs to go broader. The SDGs is not just the agenda of the UN system and the member states. It is the agenda of the entire society. We need to bring private sector on board. We need to bring academia on board with its thought leadership. And the like-minded, and create the investments. And even individual giving here has an importance, because we also understand that the traditional donorship system, which provides only the available resources to the development, and then you distribute it thinly, it'll still not make a difference. Let me illustrate here a cost and financial gaps assessment exercise which we have done on the prevention of the maternal mortality. In 153 countries where we still see a high levels of prevention of the maternal mortality, the basic investments which will be required over the next decade are estimated at $114 billion. Against the actual availability of which is not even matching 10% of it. So this is the reality. So we need to build those coalitions, because the solution will not be through a classification of an approach, but through an innovative investment-looking case building and bringing a coalition to address that around it. Thank you.
Margot, I'll give you the closing word of the panelists. I know you've been with this process for a long time, and you look poised to go into the next QCPR with gusto. Do you have some closing remarks here?
Thank you. I think on the matter of the income per capita is something that's it starts from LDC status. You know, many of the SIDS are being hurried through graduation based solely on that, when we know that, and as nature would have it, half the times before they could graduate, they get unfortunately hit by some cyclone or something, which, you know, just devastated that whole process. But yet we have criteria still coming out of that process that's just hurrying along the process. So, you know, unless we want to look at it as, you know, from the very root of it, we can't keep trimming the leaves off. The tree will keep bringing more leaves. We need to go to the root of the problem, and it stems from all the way down there, from the LDC status. So I think when we look at stuff, we need to stop, look at what's above ground and start dealing with what's underground on the issues. So just to say that on that, and of course we do look forward to engaging in this 2020 QCPR. I don't think I spoke to Brazil's question about whether it will be virtual or not. I think our experiences, hopefully from 2016, would help us to engage in whatever format we are forced to deal with at the point. I think our yearning to get to the 2030 agenda, that deadline with some progress in sustainable development will rule us and give us the drive to communicate whichever way we have to. And to get it done. So I have no fear about that. I see Marcus is rubbing his head. It might be a little bit difficult, but we will get there. You know, I think we just need to deal with whatever we have before us and use it to the best of our ability. And we do look forward to, you know, a constructive dialogue, including the Secretariat, to give us the sort of information we need so we can move forward as a group. together on this endeavor. Thanks.
Thank you very much. What a note to finish the panel on. What I like to do now is just to share a few thoughts with you. Listening to this, and in particular how the QCPR 2016 came live and some of the ways it was described. This reform has been underway for a while, but I can see, and I think comes out in the discussion, is clear progression. Some of the themes are the same. The 2030 agenda is the same, but some of them we're much more mature. We're in a very different place to discuss. I think without being able to summarize everything, I think it's very important. On one hand, we heard a lot about substance and fundamental analytics as very important. And then on the other hand, we also heard that some of the reform structures, some of the reform, you could say, tracks that are underway, they now need also to be solidified in the QCPR. I think we had a good round around data and digitization and how that can help us to understand better the situation, even maybe also collaborate more efficiency. If there's one word I take out of here is the word clear. That means we should try to be clear in what we want, clear what we are asking. And I may be over-interpreting, but the sense I have from the conversation is clear gives better implementation and clear gives better accountability. So that's, then I think there has been a very good conversation about deprivation, the situation, reality of people and countries. Is GDP a very good way of looking at this, or is it time that we transition now to a multidimensional understanding, a much more human-centric understanding? Surely something that could be of interest in the QCPR. Then I like to also close out that from when the Secretary General is trying to explain why are we doing reform, I think that the vision that I think he shares, and I think with many, is it's the UN that has the capability to focus not only on kind of results, but the results of its results. In other words, what is the impact of its ability to support member states? And it's also a longing for a UN that is less preoccupied with internal processes, a UN that spends more time engaging with the stakeholders and in its result agenda. So with those comments, I'd just like to thank from my side the audience and the panel. And Margaret, thank you very much. Casper, Robert, and Ramiz. I think we have been covering at least some part of a QCPR including the history of it. And also we have made some ideas of what could be themes looking ahead. So from my side, I would like to close out and thank everybody very, very much. And then in a sense, be happy also that the technology was on our side, so the technology did not become an unnecessary barrier. But with those remarks, it is 5 minutes to 7 my time. It is probably 5 minutes to 1 somebody else's time. So Marcus, can I give the floor back to you?
Thanks a lot, Jens. That was really very good discussion, very well moderated. Thanks a lot for that. I think we all got a little flavor of what the QCPR was looking like and will most probably also look like. So we will not be spared by all these, I don't know, night shifts or whatever. But I think we also heard that what will help to get a good resolution. So, and that was also the aim of that course, so that everyone can contribute and that a lot of flexibility will be needed. And if I take some kind of key messages from that conversation, that I would say, and somebody said it in a little bit other words, but I would say what really matters now is to link what matters with things that work and share what works. So that captures in one sentence that it's important to focus on content, but it also to focus on processes and structures, because without them we're lost. And what is also important is that everyone, all the actors in this future process will reflect on what is the intention, what do we want. I mean, the future we want is a statement that we all know, but we have to fill it also a little bit with substance from our own perspective so that we live up to that ambition. So with these couple of remarks, I would really thank Jens once again for being the panelist and moderator at the same time. Thanks for joining. Robert, Ramirez, Kasper, Margot, and of course also the team of UNITAR from their technical help. Thanks a lot for everyone. And it is also a pleasure for me to announce that the next course will be on the 2nd of July. And we already heard today in the couple of questions that has been asked, does the funding, financing, economic issues will be a kind of a very important. So the next course will be dedicated to more these specific questions around economic issues and funding and financing things. We will invest the next couple of days in putting together this program, and I'm happy that we had so many participants in that course. Thanks a lot for also all the participants. I saw that till the very end we had a lot of participants, and I hope that you could benefit a little bit from what has been said, that it is thinking deep into your brains and into your thoughts. Thanks a lot, everyone, and wishing everyone a nice day, nice night. We have a half a day here in New York. Goodbye. Thanks.